I've met a lot of people in my life who believe the world was against them, but every now and then someone walks into my studio carrying a level of suspicion so heavy it practically reshapes the air around them. That was exactly what happened the moment this young woman, let's call her Marissa, stepped onto my stage. I could see it in the way her eyes scanned the room, not searching for support, but scanning for threat. She carried herself like someone who'd spent years preparing for a battle she couldn't fully describe, yet never seemed to win. I remember the first thing she said to me. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't a thank you. It wasn't even nervous small talk. She looked straight at me and said, "Nobody here wants to help me. My family brought me because they think I'm crazy." And right then I understood the core of her struggle. This wasn't just a family dispute. This was a young woman who had built her entire emotional identity around the belief that she was being targeted, misunderstood, and betrayed by the very people trying to pull her back from the edge. Now, I don't take statements like that lightly. People who genuinely believe everyone is against them are often carrying wounds that didn't start yesterday. They come from years of misinterpretation, pain, denial, and sometimes a deep-rooted fear of being vulnerable. And when I looked into Marissa's eyes, I could tell those wounds were still open, raw, and unprocessed. As she sat down, I could almost feel her pulling away before the conversation had even begun. People often think my job is to catch them in a lie or call out their excuses, and sometimes, sure, that's part of it. But in cases like hers, my first job is simply to stand still long enough for them to stop swinging. She carried an emotional defensiveness so thick that even silence felt like an accusation to her. I could see her hands shaking, ever so slightly resting on her lap, curled in a way that told me she was bracing for impact. Her family sat across from her, a mother with eyes that looked years older than she should have been, a father with that rigid, exhausted posture I've seen 100 times before, and a younger brother who seemed torn between anger, heartbreak. They weren't perfect, no family is, but their faces told me they weren't here to attack her. They were here because they were out of tools, out of ideas, and almost out of hope. I asked her how long she'd felt this way, this constant sense that her family was plotting against her. She shrugged with the kind of indifference people use when they're hiding real pain. She said it started a few years ago, but the moment she said it, her mother started crying. That told me everything it had started long before Marissa was ready to admit. I leaned in and studied her face. She didn't want to tell the story. She wanted to win the story. There's a big difference. When someone wants to win, they twist memories into shields. They reshape facts to protect the version of themselves they feel safest being, and that version of Marissa, self-protective, hostile, wounded, had been in control for a long time. As she talked, I paid close attention to the patterns. Every conflict she described ended with her feeling attacked. Every conversation turned into an argument. Every attempt from her family to check on her mental health became, in her mind, a conspiracy. She believed they whispered about her behind closed doors. She believed her brother intentionally provoked her so he could prove she was unstable. She believed her parents were gathering evidence to eventually put her away somewhere. Now, I've been doing this long enough to know when someone is exaggerating versus when someone is living inside a distorted emotional lens they genuinely cannot see through. And with every sentence she spoke, it became clearer that Marissa wasn't lying. She was trapped inside a story she believed wholeheartedly. That made her situation far more dangerous than if she'd simply been manipulative. You can confront a manipulative person, but someone who fully believes their own distorted reality, that requires a different kind of strategy. I watched the mother cover her mouth with her hand, shaking her head as Marissa talked. She wasn't angry, she was devastated. The father stared straight ahead, stiff as a board, as if moving would cause him to break. Her brother's jaw tightened every time she accused him of something. I've seen many families crumble under the weight of one person's fear, and this was a textbook example of how that fear spreads like smoke, filling every corner of a home until no one can breathe. When Marissa described the night she ran away from home for 2 days because she claimed her family was setting her up, I noticed her eyes flickering. Not the flicker of dishonesty, but the flicker of someone reliving a moment where the fear felt so real it burned into her memory. She believed it then, she believed it now, and in her mind, she had survived something catastrophic, even though nothing catastrophic had actually happened. Her father finally spoke, voice trembling. He said they'd woken up and found her room empty, the window open, her phone left behind. They called the police. They filed a missing persons report. They searched for almost 48 hours. The mother's hands were shaking as she described driving through neighborhoods, calling her daughter's name, terrified she'd find her hurt or worse. And yet Marissa sat there, stone-faced, insisting she had no choice because they were closing in on her. When someone's emotional logic becomes disconnected from external reality, they become unreachable through traditional argument. You can't reason someone out of a belief they weren't reasoned into. Marissa's fear wasn't backed by evidence. Her fear was the evidence. Anything that contradicted her fear became part of the threat. And that meant her family's love became to her the very weapon she needed to defend herself against. As I listened to her timeline, I paid close attention to the turning points, moments where something could have changed course but didn't. There were opportunities for connection, for reassurance, for reflection, but each one had been swallowed by misunderstanding, resentment, and a deep internal narrative she'd never questioned. And what struck me most wasn't just her fear, it was her certainty. Fear combined with uncertainty is painful but manageable. Fear combined with certainty is a fortress, and Marissa had built her stone by stone. I've sat across from thousands of people who believed they were the only sane one in a room full of enemies. The stories change, the faces change, but the feeling is the same. I'm right, they're wrong, and the fact that they don't see it proves they're out to get me. That kind of mindset doesn't just drop into somebody's lap out of the clear blue sky. It's usually the end result of years of hurt, disappointment, and a slow, steady breakdown of trust. So I started walking her back, gently but firmly. I asked her to give me one specific example, just one, where her family had clearly worked against her. Not a general feeling, not they always judge me, but a concrete situation, what happened, who said what, and what the outcome was. She hesitated because specifics are a whole lot harder to bend than vague feelings. Finally, she landed on a family dinner from about a year earlier, a night, she said, changed everything. In Marissa's version, that dinner was an ambush. She said they sat her down, ganged up on her, and called her crazy. She told me they used that word. She said her brother smirked, her father called her a problem, and her mother threatened to send her away somewhere. As she described it, I watched her body language change. Her shoulders pulled up. She started rubbing her fingers together in her lap. That dinner wasn't just a memory to her, it was Exhibit A in her case that her family was plotting against her. Then I turned to her parents and her brother and had them tell me about the same night. Her mother took a long breath before she started to speak. She said that for months leading up to that dinner, they'd watched Marissa become more paranoid, more volatile, more unpredictable. She accused them of reading her text if they walked past her phone. She would slam her door and shout through it that she knew they were listening. She confronted her brother in the hallway one afternoon and screamed at him for spying on her because he'd glanced into her room as he walked by. According to her parents, they were walking on eggshells in their own home. Her father said the dinner was supposed to be an honest, loving intervention. They didn't use the word crazy, he said, but they did tell her they were scared and believed she needed a professional evaluation. They admitted they raised their voices. They admitted it was messy, that feelings got hurt. But in their minds, they weren't staging an attack. They were trying to pull their daughter back from something they didn't understand. Two very different stories about the same evening. Two people absolutely convinced they were telling the truth. I've been doing this a long time, and I know better than to play referee on who remembered it right. Human memory is not a video recorder. It's a storyteller, and it edits the footage to match the emotional script. So instead of deciding who was right, I laid out a bigger truth. I told Marissa, listen, perception is not a neutral camera, it's a filter. If you walk into a room already convinced you're under attack, then every look, every sigh, every pause is going to feel like a bullet with your name on it. I said, you came to that dinner already believing they were against you. So when they said, we're worried and we think you need help, you didn't hear concern, you heard condemnation. You didn't hear we love you and we're scared. You heard you're broken and we're done dealing with you. She bristled at that. She told me she knew exactly what she heard, that she wasn't stupid, that she wasn't imagining things. And I agreed with her on one point right away. I told her I never said you were stupid. This isn't about intelligence. Some of the brightest people I've ever sat across from have had the most distorted beliefs about themselves and the people around them. This isn't about IQ. This is about injury. That word injury hung in the air for a moment, because as we went further back into her history, it became clear that this story she was living in didn't start at that dinner table. It started years earlier when she was a little girl who felt like the odd one out in her own home. Her younger brother, in her mind, was the golden child. He got good grades, he followed the rules, teachers praised him. She was the sensitive one, the reactive one, the one whose emotions came out big and loud. When the school called, it was usually about her. When there was drama in the friend group, she was often in the middle. Over time, she didn't just get the message that she was difficult. She adopted an identity. I'm the one who ruins things. That's not just a thought. That becomes a lens. Once you put that lens on, you start scanning life for evidence to confirm it. A sigh from your mother becomes proof she's fed up with you. Your dad closing his eyes in frustration becomes proof he's embarrassed by you. Your brother getting praise becomes proof there's no space left for you to be loved without conditions. I asked her if she could remember a time, any time, when her parents really showed up for her, when they weren't criticizing or correcting, but just plain protecting. She stared at the floor for a long moment. Then, almost against her own will, she mentioned being bullied in middle school. She told me about a group of girls who made her life miserable, who posted about her online and laughed at her in the hallway. And she remembered her mother marching into that school and demanding a meeting with the principal. She remembered her mom sitting in that office, calm but fierce, insisting that the school step in. I've learned over the years that when someone recalls a moment of being protected, especially someone who believes everyone is against them, it usually slips out before they can filter it. Marissa didn't want to give her mother that credit. She didn't want to admit there had been times her family had stood by her. But the memory came up anyway, and once it surfaced, she couldn't shove it back down as easily as she wanted to. I asked her how that meeting with the school ended. She told me the bullying stopped for a while. She said the girls backed off, that the principal called their parents, that her mother checked in with her every day afterward. She tried to brush it off with a shrug, but her voice softened when she said it. It was the first moment in our conversation where her tone didn't carry that defensive edge. Her mother sat there silently crying as Marissa spoke. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears she probably didn't even realize were falling. And her father leaned forward slightly like he was afraid to breathe. Her brother watched her with this look that was somewhere between surprise and relief, as if he couldn't believe she remembered anything good. But as quickly as that softness appeared, it vanished. She pulled herself back together, leaned away, and said, "Yeah, well, that was years ago. People change." The wall went right back up. And that's the thing about deep-seated emotional narratives. The moment they're challenged, the mind scrambles to rebuild them. If her family had genuinely helped her, if they truly stood up for her, then her entire narrative of being targeted wouldn't hold up. So she rejected the memory even as she acknowledged it. I didn't push her on that. Not yet. People don't let go of their protective stories just because you point out an inconsistency. In fact, the tighter you push, the tighter they grip. What I did instead was follow the thread. I asked her what changed after that period in her life. What shifted from her feeling supported at age 12 to her feeling attacked at 23. She told me she started feeling different in high school. She said she couldn't quite explain it, but she always felt like her parents expected more from her than she could give. She said they compared her to her brother constantly. I looked at the family as she said this, and their reactions were telling. Her father's brows pulled together in confusion, her mother covered her face again, and her brother muttered something under his breath that he quickly apologized for. Then her father spoke. He said they never compared her to her brother, not once. He said they celebrated her interests, her creativity, her outspoken personality. He said that if anything, they tried harder with her because they wanted her to feel understood. But Marissa shook her head and insisted it wasn't true. And in her mind, it wasn't. Because when you already believe you don't measure up, the smallest comment can feel like a critique, the mildest suggestion can feel like a demand, and the slightest praise for someone else can feel like evidence you're not enough. As I listened, I could see a different pattern forming, one that had nothing to do with villains or conspiracies. This was about a young woman who'd been chasing a sense of belonging her entire life, but didn't trust the people offering it. Every time her parents tried to support her, she saw judgment. Every time her brother defended himself, she saw betrayal. Every time they set boundaries, she saw control. The family wasn't perfect. They made mistakes just like all families, but the narrative she'd built around their actions had grown far beyond reality. At one point, her brother asked if he could speak directly to her. I normally control the flow more tightly than that, but something in his voice told me it needed to happen. He looked at her and said he never tried to hurt her, that he never spied on her, never mocked her, never wanted anything but his sister back. He said she'd become someone he didn't recognize, someone who treated him like an adversary when all he did was try to give her space. She didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. Her eyes were fixed on a point on the floor, unmoving. That kind of emotional disconnect isn't apathy, it's survival. When a person feels cornered by truth, they shut down to avoid collapse. I shifted the focus gently. I asked her how she felt hearing her brother say that. She said she didn't believe him. She said he had always enjoyed making her look bad. She said every time she got in trouble growing up, he looked satisfied. And again, I turned to the family. They all shook their heads at once, not in a defensive way, but in that devastated, weary way families do when they've heard a version of themselves they don't recognize. That's when I decided to push a little harder, not confrontational, but direct enough to break the momentum of her narrative. I told her, you are describing a world where every single person in your family is dedicating their lives to tearing you down. You're saying your mother, your father, and your brother, three different people with different personalities, different motivations, different relationships with you, somehow woke up one morning and decided to unite against you. Does that really make sense? She opened her mouth, then stopped. I watched her eyes flicker again. This wasn't confusion, it was fear of acknowledging something that would destabilize her entire world. So she defaulted to her survival script. She said, people do things behind closed doors. You don't know what goes on in my house. I told her she was right. I wasn't in her house. But I reminded her that perception becomes reality only when we stop checking it against facts, and her facts weren't lining up with her conclusions. She wasn't ready to hear that fully, but she heard enough to stiffen in her seat. Her mother spoke again, voice trembling. She said that for years she'd tried to reach her daughter, tried to reassure her, tried to show her she wasn't the enemy. She said Marissa would slam doors, refuse to come to family events, accuse them of plotting, and then claim she had no support. As she spoke, her voice broke, her hands shook as she held a tissue to her mouth. And Marissa still didn't look at her. That's when I realized the emotional distance wasn't just a symptom, it had become her identity. If she let herself acknowledge their love, she might have to confront the possibility that the problem wasn't external. And that was a truth she wasn't ready for. So I slowed the conversation down. I told her, you're carrying a belief that has isolated you from the very people trying to hold you up. And if that belief is wrong, you're losing everything for no reason. But if it's right, you should be able to tell me something concrete, something objective that proves it. She didn't answer. And that silence told me more than any accusation she'd made so far. I've seen silence used as a weapon, and I've seen it used as a shield. With Marissa, it was the latter. She wasn't refusing to answer because she was defiant. She was refusing because she was terrified that if she opened her mouth, something in her story might crack. And once a crack forms in a belief that's been holding your emotional world together, the whole structure becomes unstable. People will do almost anything to prevent that kind of collapse, even if it means clinging tightly to something that's hurting them. I gave her a moment. Sometimes the quiet does more work than the questions. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet, but the tears didn't fall. She shook her head and said she didn't owe anyone proof. She said her feelings were enough. I understood why she believed that when someone's lived in emotional chaos for long enough, their feelings become the only compass they trust, even when that compass is spinning wildly without direction. I told her gently that feelings are real, but they're not always reliable narrators. I said, you can feel abandoned in a room full of people who love you. You can feel threatened by someone who's trying to help you. You can feel attacked when nobody raised their voice. The feeling may be real, but the conclusion might be wrong. She looked away again, and I knew those words were rubbing hard against the story she'd constructed. Her father spoke then. He said he wished she could see how many nights her mother cried herself to sleep worrying about her. He said he wished she knew how many times they drove around town looking for her when she'd disappear for hours without explanation. He said they lived in fear, not fear of her, but fear for her. It wasn't an accusation, it was a plea. But Marissa didn't take it that way. She crossed her arms and said, you're twisting it. You're trying to make yourselves look good. And the father's shoulders dropped in resignation. That reaction wasn't new to them. You could tell they'd had this same conversation dozens of times. I leaned back slightly and studied the distance between what Marissa perceived and what was actually being said. Her family wasn't denying their mistakes, they were acknowledging them. They weren't minimizing her emotions, they were trying to understand them. They weren't dismissing her experience, they were trying to separate the emotional truth from the imagined threat. But she couldn't hear any of that. Every attempt at connection ran into a wall of suspicion, so I shifted the frame again. Sometimes people won't accept facts about others, but they might accept facts about themselves. I asked her, when you think back on your childhood, do you remember feeling safe, not protected, safe? She paused. That was the first question that stopped her in her tracks. She said she didn't know. She said she didn't feel unsafe, but she didn't feel understood either. She said she always felt like she had to be careful, careful about what she said, careful about how she reacted, careful not to make things worse. I told her that living in a constant state of emotional caution can distort the world into something threatening. If you grow up feeling like every expression might cause trouble, you start anticipating danger where none exists. She didn't refute that. She didn't accept it either. She just sat with it. Her brother spoke softly, almost whispering. He said he remembered her being fun, once creative, loud, imaginative, passionate. He said she used to draw pictures and make silly videos and play pranks. He said he didn't know what happened to that version of her. She didn't look at him, but I saw her jaw tighten. She remembered that version too, but she'd buried her deep. I asked her when she stopped being that girl. She said she didn't stop. People forced her to change. They judged her reactions, criticized her tone, told her she was too much. I asked if they said those exact words, and she admitted they didn't. But that's how she heard it. She interpreted boundaries as punishments. She interpreted structure as oppression. She interpreted feedback as betrayal. I explained something I've had to explain countless times. When your emotional skin is thin, even gentle touches feel like wounds. And Marissa had been carrying that rawness for most of her life. Then came the turning moment, not a breakthrough, but the emotional collision that happens before someone either confronts their reality or doubles down on their narrative. Her mother looked at her and asked through tears why she believed they hated her. It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was a genuine, aching plea from a mother who'd run out of ways to reach her child. Marissa looked at her mother for the first time since the conversation began. Her eyes flashed not with anger, but with something sharper, more painful. She said, "Because you gave up on me." Her voice cracked just slightly. It was the first emotionally honest sentence she'd spoken the entire time. Her mother gasped, covering her mouth. Her father reached for her hand. Her brother looked down. Those 4 words, "you gave up on me," carried years of misunderstanding, expectation, disappointment, and emotional distortion. I asked Marissa when she believed that happened. She said she could feel it, just feel it around her junior year of high school. She said her mother stopped checking on her as much. She said her father seemed tired of her. She said her brother stopped wanting to hang out. I asked if they actually said they gave up on her. She admitted they never did. But she believed the shift in their behavior was proof. Her mother broke down completely. She said she never gave up. She stepped back because every attempt she made ended in a fight. She said she wasn't retreating. She was trying not to make things worse. She said she was walking on eggshells around her daughter because she didn't want to trigger another explosion. That's when I laid the truth out with precision. I said, sometimes the moment you think someone gives up is actually the moment they're trying their hardest not to lose you. Marissa's face tightened again. She swallowed hard. She looked away. The truth was pressing against her, and she wasn't ready to let it in. Because if she accepted that her family hadn't given up on her, then the entire narrative of betrayal she'd been leaning on for years would collapse. And without that narrative, she'd have to face something far more frightening herself. So instead of embracing the truth, she pushed it away. She said her mother was lying. She said her father was pretending. She said her brother was putting on a show. That's the hardest part of dealing with someone emotionally wounded. Sometimes the truth threatens them more than the lie does. I asked her one final question in that moment. If your family truly wanted to hurt you, why are they here? Why are they crying over you? Why are they begging for a chance to support you? She didn't answer. She couldn't. And in that silence, I saw a young woman trapped between the world she believed and the world she feared to step into. There's a moment in conversations like this where the emotional temperature shifts, not because someone has had a breakthrough, but because the truth has pressed in so close that the person can't run from it without exposing the fact that they're running. That's where Marissa was sitting. Her silence wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't defiance either. It was the stillness of someone trapped between two impossible choices. On one side was the painful belief that her family had abandoned her. On the other side was the equally painful possibility that she had misunderstood them for years. And the closer we got to that crossroads, the more afraid she became. I've learned that when someone is this deeply invested in a distorted narrative, you have to approach with equal parts honesty and compassion. If you soften too much, they dismiss you. If you push too hard, they shut down. So I narrowed the focus to something she couldn't dodge her own patterns. I asked her what she did when she felt rejected. She said she pulled away. I asked what she did when she felt criticized. She said she defended herself. I asked what she did when someone tried to help. She said she pushed them away because she didn't want to owe anybody anything. That right there was the heart of her story. Not the family dinner, not the arguments, not the accusations. The real issue was that she believed accepting help meant admitting weakness. And in her mind, weakness was dangerous. Weakness meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant exposure. Exposure meant people could hurt her. So she built an identity around self-protection, an identity so rigid she couldn't tell the difference between support and attack anymore. Her father asked her why accepting help was so threatening to her. She said nobody really helps without wanting something in return. That's a worldview shaped not by the people in front of her, but by old wounds she'd never resolved. People who grow up feeling misunderstood often cling to the idea that self-reliance is the only safe path. But self-reliance taken to an extreme becomes isolation, and isolation, when fueled by fear, becomes paranoia. I asked her if she ever considered that her family stepped back, not because they gave up, but because they felt everything they said made the situation worse. She didn't reject it outright this time. She said maybe that was true. But then she followed it with, "It doesn't matter. They should have tried harder." That sentence landed heavy in the air. Expectations built on fantasy are impossible for any family to meet. No matter how hard they reached for her, it would have felt insufficient as long as she was measuring their love through the lens of old pain. Her brother looked at her with exhausted honesty. He said he did back off, not because he wanted distance, but because every time he tried to talk to her, she accused him of mocking her. He said it reached a point where he didn't know how to approach her without being treated like an enemy. Marissa didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just looked numb. People assume numbness means someone doesn't care. But in reality, numbness is what happens when a person feels too much and shuts down to survive it. I decided it was time to test the edges of her certainty. I told her, your story of being targeted has become the foundation you stand on. But foundations built on fear can't support the weight of your future. If you're wrong about your family, then you've spent years fighting ghosts. And if you're right, then you should be able to tell me one specific thing they did that proves they're a threat. Her breathing changed slightly. She was bracing herself. Then she said something that told me everything about the emotional landscape she'd been living in. She said, I don't need proof. I can feel when people want to hurt me. That sentence is one I've heard in various forms over the decades. And it always tells me the same thing. This isn't about facts. This is about fear that grew legs, learned to walk, and eventually convinced the person it was leading them to safety when it was actually leading them deeper into isolation. I turned to her family and asked them to describe the last big fight they had before coming to the show. Her mother said it happened a month earlier. Marissa had overheard them talking in the kitchen about whether they should encourage her to see a therapist again. They weren't mocking her, they weren't criticizing her, they were scared. But Marissa came downstairs shaking with fury, accusing them of plotting to lock her in a psychiatric hospital. She packed a bag and left for 2 days. When she came back, she refused to speak to them except through closed doors. Marissa insisted that the way her mother looked at her that night proved everything. She said her mother's expression was cold and calculating. Her mother, through tears, said she was terrified. She said she'd been trying to hold it together so her daughter wouldn't see how scared she was. That disconnect, one person expressing fear, the other interpreting malice, is how families break long before they realize they're fractured. I asked Marissa if she ever considered that what she saw as coldness might have been fear. She didn't answer, but her eyes dropped again, and that told me she heard the question even if she couldn't respond to it. I told her, you're treating your interpretations as facts. But interpretations aren't facts. They're reflections of your emotional state at the moment you form them. If you're hurting, everything looks like harm. If you're scared, everything looks like danger. If you feel alone, everything looks like abandonment. Then I asked her something more direct. Has anyone in your family ever physically harmed you, threatened you, manipulated you for personal gain? She said no, quietly, almost reluctantly. I followed that with, has anyone in your family told you they wanted to get rid of you or that they don't care about your well-being? She said no again. I let the silence stretch for a few beats so she could sit in the gap between her beliefs and her reality. Then I said, if the facts don't match the story, you need to ask yourself why you're holding on to the story so tightly. Her bottom lip trembled for half a second. It was the closest she came to breaking, but right as the truth nudged into her awareness, she recoiled from it. She said her family was only pretending to care because they were on television. She said they didn't want to look bad in front of the audience. That was her escape hatch. When emotional pressure becomes unbearable, people often retreat into the story that feels safest, even if it's the least accurate. Her father closed his eyes as she said it like he'd been punched in the chest. He wasn't angry, he was defeated. He whispered, we didn't come here for the cameras. We came because we don't know how to help you anymore. For the first time, Marissa looked shaken. Not open, not receptive, just shaken. Because in that moment, the weight of her father's sincerity collided with the belief she'd built her identity around. Her world was wobbling, and instead of reaching for stability, she braced for collapse. I told her something she needed to hear but wasn't ready to accept. Sometimes the hardest truth is that the enemy you're fighting is coming from inside you, not from the people sitting in front of you. Her eyes darted away, her breathing quickened. She didn't argue, but she didn't take it in either. She was suspended between denial and recognition, and that's the most volatile emotional space a person can occupy. Her mother whispered that she just wanted her daughter back. Her brother nodded, tears in his eyes. Her father rested his head in his hands. But Marissa didn't reach out. She didn't accept the love being offered. She retreated into silence again, the silence of someone who thinks letting go of their pain means having nothing left to hold on to. And that's when I realized this wasn't going to be one of those moments where the walls come down. This was going to be one of those moments where the truth knocks, but fear refuses to open the door. There's a point in every conversation like this where you have to decide whether the goal is breakthrough or clarity. A breakthrough requires the person to lower their defenses, to let the truth in, to accept responsibility for their perceptions. But clarity can happen even when the person refuses to change. Clarity is when the room knows what the truth is, even if the person at the center of it can't accept it. With Marissa, it became clear that clarity was the best we were going to get. Her silence stretched on thick and heavy. I've sat with silence more times than I can count. People assume it means nothing is happening, but I know better. Silence is where the war gets fought. It's where the person weighs whether admitting the truth is more painful than believing the lie. It's where the old wounds speak louder than the present moment. And for Marissa, that silence was a battlefield she wasn't ready to cross. I shifted my tone slightly, softened it, but didn't weaken it. I told her that holding on to a story that isolates her might feel like safety, but it guarantees loneliness. I said, you're protecting yourself from a threat that doesn't exist, and in doing so, you're creating the very thing you fear, being alone. She blinked just once slower than normal, and I knew the words landed somewhere inside her, even if she'd never admit it. Her mother reached toward her just slightly, not touching her, but extending a hand as if to say, I'm here if you want me. And Marissa's eyes flicked to that hand for a second before darting away again. That was the closest she came to connection, and it lasted less than a heartbeat. She wasn't rejecting the gesture because she didn't want it. She was rejecting it because wanting it terrified her. If she took her mother's hand, she'd have to accept the possibility that the family wasn't the enemy. And if they weren't the enemy, then she'd have to face the fear that lived inside her alone. I asked her what she wanted from her family, not what she expected or assumed, but what she genuinely wanted. At first she said she didn't know. Then she said she wanted to be understood. Then she said she wanted to feel safe around them. And then quietly she said she wanted them to stop judging her. But when I asked her to describe how they judged her, she had no concrete examples, just the feeling, always the feeling. Her feelings were real, her conclusions were not. I told her that trust isn't built on assumptions, it's built on evidence. And the evidence in front of her was a family who showed up, who cried, who pleaded, who didn't storm off in anger, even after years of being accused and misunderstood. But instead of absorbing that truth, she twisted it again. She said they were performing because they didn't want to look like bad parents. She said they were faking it. She said people can cry for show. Her brother broke then, not in anger, but in heartbreak. He said, what do you want me to do? How do I prove I'm on your side? She didn't answer. She stared ahead like the question wasn't meant for her. And in a way it wasn't, because she wasn't capable of receiving it. When someone's worldview is built on fear, proof doesn't matter. Proof becomes irrelevant. Proof becomes invisible. I decided to hold up a mirror in the simplest way possible. I said, you're asking your family to prove something you've already decided they can't prove. That's not a fair fight. That's not even a fight. It's a sentence you've already handed down, and nothing they do will overturn it. She swallowed hard at that. She didn't deny it. And that told me she knew deep down that some part of what I was saying was true. But acknowledging it would mean dismantling the emotional fortress she'd lived inside for years. And she wasn't ready for that kind of demolition. I explained to her that emotional injuries don't heal by doubling down on the story that caused them. They heal when the person is willing to look inward, to ask themselves whether their reactions match the reality in front of them. But Marissa wasn't there. She was stuck in that limbo where a person knows something is wrong but isn't willing to take the step that leads to resolution. Her father leaned forward and asked her if she wanted help, real help. She didn't respond at first. Then she said she didn't need help, she needed them to stop twisting everything. That was her way of rejecting the truth without having to confront it directly. Her mother wiped her eyes and asked if there was anything they could say that she would believe. Marissa said no. That wasn't defiance. That was surrender to the narrative she'd built. The story was safer than uncertainty. The story was familiar. The story required nothing from her except repetition. The truth required introspection, vulnerability, and accountability. And she wasn't ready for any of that. I sat back and let the weight of that reality settle in the room. I've had guests who resisted the truth, fought the truth, avoided the truth, but with Marissa, it wasn't a fight, it was a retreat. She wasn't pushing back, she was hiding. And the tragedy of that kind of hiding is that it builds a cage that only the person inside can unlock. I told her one final thing before we wrapped. I said, you don't have to believe your family today. You don't even have to trust them right now. But at some point in your life, you're going to hit a moment where the story you're holding on to stops working. And when that day comes, I hope you remember that the people sitting in front of you today were never your enemies. They weren't perfect. They made mistakes, but they showed up. And sometimes showing up is the loudest expression of love a family can give. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't soften. She just sat there frozen in the identity she'd clung to for so long. A young woman convinced she was alone, even while surrounded by people breaking apart under the weight of loving her. As the show wrapped, her family hugged one another. Her mother reached for her again, hesitated, then lowered her hand. Marissa stood stiff, unmoved, unreachable in that moment, and I knew that if change ever came for her, it wouldn't come from anything said that day. It would come from the slow erosion of a story she could no longer sustain. But that day hadn't come yet. When she walked off the stage, her family followed a few steps behind, still hoping, still hurting, and I watched the distance between them, not physical distance, but emotional distance, and I knew it was a distance she wasn't ready to cross. People assume every story ends with a breakthrough, a transformation, a moment of revelation. But real life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes people leave exactly as they arrived, guarded, afraid, committed to a narrative that shields them from pain while cutting them off from love. And sometimes the most honest outcome is acknowledging that the story didn't change because the person wasn't ready to change. Marissa walked away carrying the same beliefs she carried in, and her family walked away carrying the same hope and heartbreak they'd been carrying for years. And that's the truth of it. Not every story ends with healing. Some stories end with the possibility of healing lingering in the distance, waiting for the moment the person decides to reach for it.